Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hull Simmer channel. It's great to be back this Friday. Hope everyone has had a great week and a wonderful weekend. Last time we streamed, uh, we covered the six, and this time we're going to back up again and talk about some flight fundamentals that we that sometimes probably likely in a flight school you'll cover some of these things maybe early on. I have put them off just a bit, but want to uh, cover them so that you understand some kind of fundamental principles that are related to flight. And so I want to do that at this particular time. So what I'm going to do is start off with finding a graphic on the four forces that impact flight and pull that up for you. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, and you should see this in just a few seconds. This is very commonly shown in aviation training. And what you have are the four forces of flight that impact flight. What you have is you have lift. Lift always works counter to weight. So lift is the force that pulls the airplane up as the wings flow through the air. Weight pulls down, as we know. We have gravitational forces we deal with, so we deal with weight, and that opposes lift. And then you have thrust, primarily generated by the propeller, which propels the airplane forward, and that opposes drag. So there's a cost. When an airplane moves faster and faster through the air, drag will also increase. So as you get an increase in thrust, you also tend to have an increase in drag as well. And so there's a cost there when it comes to those two opposing forces. So those are the primary forces that impact flight, and wanted to start there. And then want to now zoom in on the lift part. So I'm going to show another graphic here shortly to dive into a little more detail on lift. So we have one thing I was taught, and I thought that this was a primary force of lift in the past. I think based on some recent things I've read that there's some controversy on that, but I'll mention it anyway, and that's the Bernoulli effect, which gives some lift. It says here in the graphic, but it is not the primary force which keeps the plane aloft. So what's going on there when we talk about the Bernoulli effect is there is wind. So you see the kind of a cross section of the wing as if you sliced the wing and you were looking uh, right at the edge of the wing. And there's wind that is flowing over the wing, and then there is wind that flows under the wing. And I think one of the points of controversy uh, is do those. One thing I was taught in the past is that the wind flying or flowing over the top of the wing meets at the same time as the wind flowing under the wing. And when it because the wind that's going over the wing has to travel more distance, it is flowing faster versus the wind under the wing, and that those two wind currents, as it were, meet together at the trailing edge of the wing at the same time. And therefore, what happens is you get a low pressure at the top of the wing and a high pressure at the bottom of the wing, and this generates lift. So that's the Bernoulli effect. I believe that Bernoulli was I don't know if it's French scientist but it's named after a person. Uh, so anyway, that is somewhat in controversy. One of the things that's in controversy based on a video I looked at recently is that does the wind actually meet at the same time at the trailing edge of the wing? And there's some thought now that maybe that's not the case. In fact, I think one feeling is it's been proven it doesn't meet at the same time at the end. And so this graphic is saying that may still be a force, or an impact on lift, or a factor, I should say, in lift, but maybe not as much of a factor as maybe previously thought. Uh, the primary source of lift, I think, maybe could be more modern thinking. I'm not definite on that, and that is that the again Newton's third law of there's the equal and opposite reaction, because there's a downward force of air that goes downward from the wing as the wing is flowing. It pushes the air down. The opposite reaction is to generate lift. So those are factors that are often discussed when it comes to what generates lift for a wing. So I want to talk about that, and then what I want to do is talk about angle of attack next. So I am going to go to yet a third change on the screen, or third image I want to show. And this should pull up here. And so what's going on here with angle of attack? So if you think of yourself, you're riding your bicycle through the wind. The wind is going to be coming at you because you're moving one direction, and the wind is going to be coming at you. And that is called relative wind. It is relative to the direction that you're going through the wind. That relative wind is symbolized here by the yellow arrow with flow on it. So it's wind that's coming at you. Then if you look at the wing, there's a chord line that runs. You see chord line there with the arrow. It's an imaginary line that runs from the leading edge of the wing to the trailing edge of the wing. And you see that depending on how, you're moving through the air, but if you're moving through the air in straight and level flight, your angle of attack is not as high. Your wing is more down. We'll show this. I'll try to demo this in flight. And so your angle of attack is not as great. But as you slow the airplane down, if you're trying to maintain straight and level flight, for example, your wing is going to be at a higher angle of attack because you need to generate more lift, more of that Bernoulli well, actually probably both Bernoulli and Newton's law there, where you need more downward motion, for example, uh, and obviously more lift needs to be generated when you're flying slow. So that's why you have to come into the wind at a greater angle of attack. So you see there's this angle of attack that has to do with the way that the chord line relates to the flow of the relative wind. And then what you see, if you look at the lower left, what happens is there's a point. So you want, generally, the wind should be flowing smoothly over the wing. But as you slow down, and if you go too slow, what's going to happen is you need greater and greater angle of attack against the relative wind. And so that starts to churn you get a kind of a tumbling effect, or a burbling effect of the wind, where you get these vortices. And so the wind stops flowing smoothly over the wing, and therefore you go into a stall. And you may have heard that term, where the plane will then start to sort of fall through the sky because the wind is no longer flowing smoothly over the wing, and therefore it sort of breaks the smooth flow that you need in order to generate lift. And that's why you get a stall, because the angle of attack is too great at that point. So to demonstrate that angle of attack, what I'm going to do is momentarily take off the image. And what I'm going to do is go into a flight here. I've already got it set up. At least I hope I have it set up. So so here I am, I'm flying. And pretty much straight and level. I have to adjust my airspeed because I just loaded this. My throttle's not set perfectly. But what I want to do is, if I go outside the plane and so if I'm flying straight and level, the angle of attack, so the relative wind is coming in, you see my mouse, the relative wind is coming in this way. And therefore, whoops. Therefore, the angle, the angle of attack is not as great, because here's the chord line going through the wing there, from the leading edge to the trailing edge. And it's the angle of attack is not as great at this point. So if I go back into the plane and I start to slow down, let's say I'm going to slow down, and I'm just going to, and notice as I slow down, I'm going to have to raise the nose to increase the angle of attack to try to stay. I'm going to try to shoot for like 55 knots, see if I can get there. So right now, if you look at the airspeed indicator, which is one of those instruments we talked about before, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to trim for this new airspeed a little bit. My trim, because my trim is on the throttle, it makes it tough to trim for the airspeed. We'll talk about trim in just a bit. But okay, so right now I'm going 50 knots. I'm gonna add a little power here just to try to stay level. So now if I go outside, the wing, so the relative wind is still, because I'm flying straight level, it's still coming in this way. That hasn't changed, but the angle of the wing here, related to the wind, is going to be at a greater angle. It might be a little hard to tell here, but the plane is a little bit more nose high because I'm in slower flight. So if I keep doing that, so I've got, the air at this point is flowing smoothly over the wing. And so as I slow the airspeed down, which again, as you recall, is over here, what's going to happen? I get a stall horn, because now I would in real life feel vibration, and therefore I have to lower the nose and add power to get out of the stall. So that's a demo of those last few graphics that I was showing you, so that you can see that and see what's going on there. So I did want to demonstrate that. And so now I'm going to talk about the climb just a bit. So I'm going to pull up yet another image for you. So on the screen here, we have the image that's giving some information related to a climb. So let's say we're doing a steady climb. For example, we've just taken off from the airport and we're climbing. What's going to happen here is we're in straight and level flight. Um, you have the lift going straight up. What happens is, because of the fact that, see the relative wind? see how it now, because of the way we're moving through the wind, see how the relative wind, which is that pink arrow, is now sort of pointing down. We're moving through the wind, but now the relative wind is moving sort of down. Because of that, because of the way we're moving through the air, the lift starts to tilt backward. So you see the lift is now at an angle, and that's what creates our climb. We still have the thrust and the drag, those forces opposing each other. But notice that with weight, you see the rearward component of weight. Rearward component of weight. You see the red line, which is the main weight, but then you see a dashed green arrow. That's the component of weight that is opposed to lift. It's opposite of lift. And the distance between the opposing weight to lift and the downward red arrow, the real weight, is the what's called the rearward I can't say that word, rearward component of weight. So if you take that black line, what's happening there is, if you were to imagine taking that black line that is the rearward component of weight and you add that to drag, its drag increases, and what happens is, therefore, thrust has to increase to match the drag, and that is called excess thrust. So you see how a climb is handled. And then we also have a descent. So I'm going to show that as well. Find that particular image and pull that up. So now what's happening is the relative wind. Do you see the arrow that says drag D? Don't worry about all the mathematics here. I could not find an image that was a real good one to show descent, so I had to use this one. But the relative wind that's coming into the plane, that is in the same direction as that drag arrow. So it's coming in now. It's coming in sort of angling up now towards the airplane because it's descending. So what happens here is, because of that, the lift component is now tilted forward because now you're in a descent. So now what happens is, if you tried to, if you saw this, what happens is, when I slow down the airplane, what I'm doing there is and I try to stay straight and level, by the way. Let's say I'm not doing a descent. When I slow the airplane down, if you can picture in your mind, I am decreasing the amount of thrust because I have less power. But also what's happening is I'm increasing drag, which slows my airplane down. Okay? So if I keep holding the yoke back to try to maintain straight level, that's what's going to happen. Your airplane's going to slow down because you get a decrease in thrust and an increase in drag. So if we don't do that, if we don't hold the yoke back, the airplane is just, the nose is going to naturally drop down. So if we're flying at, say, 90 knots and we don't do any trim adjustments, the plane is going to, the nose is going to drop and it's going to descend at 90 knots. And so what happens here is, you still get the downward weight. You see that arrow pointing straight down. You still have that. That's always there. But then you have a component of weight that sort of is that part that opposes lift. Again, there's always that component of weight, and it's opposing lift. You see that arrow, that's the opposite of lift. And that distance between there shifts forward. So it's shifting forward to, uh, in the way the forces work, it basically shifts forward so that you maintain your airspeed. So there's that component of weight that moves forward, shown by that sort of that dashed line at the bottom there. That's at a little bit of an angle between the downward weight and the component of weight that is perpendicular to direction of flight. And it's so basically the weight is shifting forward and you maintain your airspeed and you descend. Okay. So hopefully this helps you get your mind around some of the components, the four forces, how they interact when you're in straight and level, when you're in a climb, and when you're in a descent. So I'm not going to cover turns. That's going to be covered later, but I'm going to kind of show you some things now in flight. So I'm going to load. I think I created a flight here, straight and level at 90 knots. I'm going to select that and load that particular flight. While that's loading, I'm going to remove that, get that graphic out of the way so we could do some demonstrations. I'm not going to do turns this particular stream. I'm going to save that for the next stream or two. I have to see what I have lined up for you next Friday. So be sure to stay tuned for that. So here we are. We are flying straight and level. What I want to show right now is we have the yoke, right? Which is this, kind of like our plane's steering wheel, so to speak. So we have the yoke. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull back on the yoke. And when I do that, like I'm in a climb, what's going to happen is, one thing you'll notice is the airspeed. Look at the airspeed over here. The airspeed is going to slow down. And if I keep pulling back, I'm not going to keep pulling back, but if I were to keep pulling, I'll kind of hold it here at 60 knots. If I keep pulling back, I would end up eventually going into a stall. The airspeed would just slow down, down some more, and I would go into a stall. So we see that that's what happens when you pull back on the yoke. You lose airspeed, assuming you don't add any power. You're just basically pulling back on the yoke. Now, if I push forward on the yoke, we're going to gain airspeed. So if we're descending, you see that all of a sudden we start to really pick up on our airspeed. We're at 90 knots and approaching, let's say, if I would push a little further down, that's 100 knots. So we see that the impact of pulling back on the yoke, which again pitches your nose up, which slows down the airspeed, or pushing forward on the yoke, which will then eventually pitch us downward and pick up at airspeed. So we start there. Now what I'm going to do is go from that straight and level at 90 knots again. So let me reload that particular, let me reload the flight just so that I have a clean start. So as this is loading, what I'm going to show you next is what happens if you're flying straight and level, and you're flying, in this case, at 90 knots. It could be straight and level at 80 knots. It could be straight and level at 100 knots. I just picked the 90 knots. Okay, so you can fly straight and level at different airspeeds, which is actually something we're going to get to. But for right now, you'll load this up. We're back to 90 knots. Next, I want to show you what happens if I do not touch the yoke. So what I'm going to do is I want to show you, I'm not even going to touch the yoke. Uh, all I'm going to do, I'm going to leave this alone. All I'm going to do is now, unless the plane starts to bank, but I think it's pretty level. I might have to control the ailerons a little bit, but we'll see. I'm going to add power, and you'll notice what happens here when you add power. The plane wants to climb. So you see how it's climbing. I'm going to have to keep it straight and level by just doing this, but I'm not going to push forward on the yoke like I did before. So you see that adding power forces it to climb. But the interesting thing here is because I'm not pushing on the yoke, notice I maintain 90 knots, okay? So the plane may rock a little bit, go up and down, but eventually the aircraft will settle at 90 knots because I'm trimmed, and this is the trim wheel right here, the pitch trim. I am trimmed for 90 knots. So trim is somewhat like cruise control in a way, in that you can control your airspeed with it. So see how it's settled at 90 knots even though I added power? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly reduce power to where I'm in a descent. And what's going to happen here as I do that, I'm descending now, is notice when you reduce power, your nose starts to drop, and now you're in a descent. But because I'm not pushing on the yoke or pulling on the yoke at all, I'm just going to go down to about 2100 RPM. You'll notice it still settles to about 90 knots because that is the where I have my trim set. I have it set for 90 knots. So it should settle to around about 90 knots. And it's going a little faster than that, but you get the idea that roughly, and it may just back off a little, maybe be rocking just a little bit, but it's going to settle at that roughly 90 knots. And that's where again, you'll notice I'm not pushing and pulling on the yoke there, where the first time around, when I pulled back on the yoke, we saw the airspeed decrease. So when I push forward on the yoke, we saw the airspeed increase. But if we don't do that and we just play with the power, we can increase, we can climb or descend based on power, and yet that will not, other things being left alone, we will maintain that airspeed, which is pretty cool. So I want to show that. So now, if you have those principles in mind, what I want to do next is I actually want to change airspeeds. So I'm going to be in straight and level at 90 knots. So what I'm going to do, trying to decide if I want to reload the flight again. Let me just reload it just to start clean again. So what we're going to do here is we're going to stay straight and level, okay? But we're going to change airspeeds. I'm going to show you how to do that and some things to keep in mind as you're doing that. So here we are. Once again, straight and level, pretty much at 90 knots. What if I want to go 100 knots? So what if I want to go from here at, right now I'm about 92, but, 90 knots, and I want to go to, say, 100 knots. So I want to increase by 10 knots. what do I do to do that, right? How do I, and to stay straight and level, not to climb or descend? Because remember when the last demo I did, when I added power, the plane wants to climb. So how do you keep it straight and level, but yet add 10 more knots so that you're at 100 knots instead of 90 knots? So the first thing you do is you're going to add the power, and that's going to cause an increase in airspeed because you're adding thrust. But what I'm going to do now is I'm holding the nose down with the yoke a little bit. And then I'm going to back off the power just a touch when I get to 100. So I had to hold the nose down when I was adding power so it wouldn't climb. The problem here is I keep having to hold the nose down, and I don't want to with the yoke. Well, I don't want to do that. So that's where trim comes into play. So if I back this off a little bit, there's a trim wheel, and so it's wanting to keep climbing. So what I'm going to have to do is use nose down trim, which this trim wheel is really sensitive. So what I'm going to do, instead of doing this with the mouse on the trim wheel, nose down is this way. See how it wants to pitch down? I want to just add just enough trim so that I don't have to keep pushing down on the yoke, which I added too much trim. So I'm going to back it up, and I'm going to do it through the buttons that I have on my, which gives a little more final control, but it's probably not sensitive enough. I'm going to try to maintain that 100 knots by using trim. So what I'm doing, I'm trimming, and see it's wanting to drop. So I need to add a little nose up trim, a little more. What you do is you sort of let go of the yoke, and then you have to play around until you get it right about right. For me, see, the problem with my problem is I have the trim, piece of my Thrustmaster, the joystick, is on the throttle, and that creates a problem because now I'm having to. I keep changing my the power I'm adding to the plane. So let me do this again. I'm going to add power, hold the nose down until I get to 100. And then when I get to 100, I might need to back off the power just a bit. And now I'm going to try to apply that trim. That's about right there. And now I'm flying about 100 knots, pretty much straight and level. I might need to back my power off just a little bit, but right about there is where we are. We're at 100 knots. Okay, so it's pitch. So you can add power, pitch your nose down because it wants to climb, and then you're going to apply your trim, and now you're at 100 knots. Now let's try decreasing. So we're going to decrease this time as I zoom in. We're going to go from 100 knots to 80 knots. So in this case, instead of adding power, we're going to decrease power. What's going to happen, if we decrease power, the nose is going to want to drop. So we have to hold the yoke back as we decrease power. And then when we get to 80 knots, we're going to add just a touch of power to try to hold that 80. We're getting close. There's 80 knots right there. Add a little power. And now what we have to do is we have to add a little nose up trim. Right about, oops, not right about there. I added too much, so it's like I have to keep playing until I get it right. I don't know if my trim wheel's sensitive enough, but see, I've gone to 75, and I am descending, so I need to add a little power there. But that's close, yeah, about right there. That's about 80 knots, right there. So what I did there is we were at 100 knots. I had to decrease power, watch my airspeed till the needle slowed down. Now I'm going 75. So the needle slowed down. In that case, I'd have to pitch down a little bit, or I don't want to descend, so I have to kind of keep my eye on the vertical speed indicator right here, and also the altimeter to make sure I'm staying level. But anyway, so I was at 100 knots. I had to basically slow the plane down, so I had to back off the throttle, which is here. And then when it slowed down to 80, add just a touch of power. But meanwhile, while I'm slowing down, I have to hold the yoke back because the nose wants to drop until I get to 80, add a little power, and then trim to try to maintain that new airspeed. So you have to play with that to get used to that concept, but it's basically you adjust your power, and then you adjust your pitch, because if you're adding speed, your nose wants to raise. If you're slowing down, your nose wants to drop. So you're having to either push in on your yoke or hold back on your yoke, and then you're applying trim at the end there once you reach your airspeed. So that's a couple of examples. Now let's try. Right now, I'm going to do a climb to straighten level. So I'm going to load that. Once again, we're going to be at 90 knots. So what we're going to do here as this is loading up, we're going to do a climb, and we're going to try to level off at 2,000 feet. And I'm going to show you the steps to go through as we do that. And before we do that, I want to talk about the leveling off. So right now, we are already at 2,000 feet, so I think I'm going to level off at, I'm going to level off at 3,000 feet. You know what? I think did I load the wrong thing? Let me see. This is what I wanted. I knew I messed up. Okay. I should be at a climb, not straight level. Because I'm pretending like I just took off from the airport. So this is loading. I want to talk about some things before we go through the steps. So right now, I'm going to actually purposely push the nose down a little bit so that we are not climbing too fast. Let's say we want to, we're at 1,100 feet. We talked about the altimeter in a past stream. Let's say we want to level off at 2,000 feet. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to push the nose down here. If you look at your vertical speed indicator, if we're climbing at 500, which is right there, if we're climbing at 500 feet a minute, or 1,000 feet a minute, right, depending on just how fast we want to climb, what we could do is we could use the 10% rule on when to push the nose down when we get close to 2,000 feet. So if we're climbing, let me look at the altimeter here. If we're climbing at 500 feet a minute, right there, for example, we want to take 10% of 500, which is 50 feet, which would be right about here. So when this long hand here that's going around, when it reaches here, about 50 feet before 2,000, that's when we want to push the nose down and start to level off. My problem is I usually tend to push it down too quickly and level off a little too early. If we're climbing at 900 feet a minute, we would want to start leveling off at 90 feet. So that's 10% of 900, which is 20, 40, 60, 80. This is about right here in between this area. If we're climbing at 1,000 feet a minute, we would want to level off at 100 feet before 2,000, which would be right here at the 9. That's 100 feet before 2,000. So right now, we're getting close to 2,000, so I better So what we're going to do here, we're getting close. I'm going to just try to keep it at 500. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see. So we are to the point. Okay, there we are, about 50 feet before. Notice I told you to go down too fast. We're now zooming in on 2,000 feet. And there we are. So we're going to push this down. Now we're going to look at our airspeed. Let's say we want to stop at 100 knots. So we were at full power. We saw that when we nosed down, the airspeed increased, right? So full power, the airspeed increased. Let me talk to the air traffic control here.
Spirit Tower Cessna Alpha Sierra X-ray Golf Sierra frequency change.
So we had to pitch forward because remember, when you're full power and you're climbing, you have to pitch forward when you get close to 2,000, in this case 2,000 feet, and then we get to whatever airspeed we want, and then we back off the power. So right now, let's say we want to do 100 knots, back off the power, and then we do our trim. Remember, we talked about we have to trim to maintain that particular airspeed, which I think is about right there. I think we got it trimmed pretty well, maybe a little more. We're right about there. Anyway, so now we're flying straight and level again. Let me get rid of that sound. So again, we were climbing. We have to determine how fast we're climbing. Use the 10% rule to determine when we pitch the nose forward to level off. Allow the airspeed to pick up to the desired airspeed, and then back our power off to maintain that airspeed. So now, in the next example, we're going to talk about what if you're in straight and level and you want to climb. So we're in straight and level right now. And let's say we want to level off at 3,000 feet. So what we're going to do in order to do this is we're going to basically ease the yoke back and get to basically the speed we want. So let's say we want to climb at, I'll just pick, let's say 80 knots. I'm going to go there. I'm going to add my power to climb at 80 knots. I may have to lower the nose a bit, but there I am. What I can do here is I could trim for 80 knots. So I got to use a little nose up trim to trim for that 80 knots. Okay. So I'm flying about 85, but I think the trim is going to settle it to 80. And I'm climbing. My airspeed at this point at 80 knots will settle to, looks like maybe, let's see what it does if I force it to about 500. I'm climbing about 500 feet a minute. So what I want to do is when I get to about, again, 10% rule, 10% of 500 is 50, so about 50 feet before I get to 3,000, 2,950 in other words, I'm going to pitch the nose down. And we'll shoot for, let's say we shoot for 90 knots this time for straight and level. So I'm going to wait till I get close to that point. And we're almost there. There we go. And I need to do it slowly. I'm always doing it too quickly. I'll bring the nose down. And now I'm almost to 90 knots. So now I'm going to back the power off. Now I've reached 90. And what I need to do now is basically trim for that airspeed. Which in this case I had to use nose down trim, and you'll get used to that, because if you trim the wrong way, you'll feel yourself having to correct for it, and you'll get a feel for using moving the trim wheel the appropriate way. So that basically what happens in the real world, apparently you feel pressure on the yoke, and when you trim it for the correct airspeed, you won't have to put pressure on the yoke anymore. You'll be able to take your hands off of it essentially. So we are trimmed at 90 knots, basically at 3,000 feet. I can probably back the power off a little bit because I'm climbing just a touch. So just easing the throttle back just a little, ever so slightly. But now what we're going to do is we're going to go from straight and level to a descent. So what I'm going to do, let's say I wanted to descend at 80 knots. Let's just pick that. Again, you can descend at whatever airspeed you want. But in this case, what I'm going to do, you always reduce power to descend, okay? So I'm going to basically reduce my power to, which is over here, I'm going to reduce it to 1500, which is the 1.5 here, 1500 RPM. Basically idle, like we're gliding. And let's shoot for 80 knots. So what's going to happen is I'm going to hold the nose up until I get to 80 knots. I slow down to 80 because right now I'm at 9. I'm a little bit over 90. I'm 92 knots right here. So I'm going to ease back the throttle. It's going to slow the plane down, and when I reach 80 knots, I'm going to let the nose drop, and then I'm going to trim for that. So easing the power back. In this case, I'm going to hold the nose up because it's going to want to drop, remember. And I'm already at 80 knots, so I'm going to let the nose drop. I got a little behind it until there's 80 right there. So I'm going to raise the nose. So if you're going too fast, raise the nose. If you're going too slow, lower it. So I'm going to raise the nose till I get to that 80 knots. Settle in there. And then I'm going to apply trim so I don't have to keep holding the yoke back. Try to get it settled there. So now in this case, we are descending at about 1,000. Yeah, and a little more nose up trim. Now we're descending. It looks like about 700 feet a minute. So in this case, if I want to level off from the descent at, say, 2,000 feet, I could use that 10%. So if I'm descending at 700 feet, I'll be about 70 feet above 2,000, so 2,070. And then I'll want to raise the nose when I get to that point slowly. So we're coming up on 2,000. I'm going to raise the nose slowly, get it even here. And then what I could do, I don't want to stall, so I want to add power and get to the airspeed I want. So let's say I want to get back to, say, 90. So I'm going to add power. And because I'm adding power, the nose wants to rise again, so I have to keep pushing the yoke forward until I get, there's 90. I'm going to back off the power now. And I went a little too slow because I was trying to explain things to you, but chewing gum and walking at the same time is hard to do. Anyway, right there, I think is good. So now I'm going to use a little nose down trim so that I don't have to keep pushing the yoke forward. Right about there, a little bit too far. Yeah, I think we're good. That was a good one. So now we're basically trimmed for about 90 knots here. And gonna add just a little nose up trim. There we go. And there we have it. So that is descent to straight and level. And you're going to use that 10% rule often when you're making those transitions. So again, if you're climbing or descending at 50 feet, that means you're going to make your transition 50 feet before you reach your target altitude. If you're climbing and descending at 1,000 feet, for example, it's going to be 100 feet before the target altitude. So keep that 10%, and glance at your vertical speed indicator here to see what your uh, how fast you are climbing and descending. And some of this you'll probably memorize as you get familiar with your power settings and how that relates to your climbs and descents and straight levels and all that. So I think I've covered everything that I want to cover for this particular stream. I hope you find this helpful. I would encourage you to practice all this. So practice changing airspeeds at straight and level, okay? Practice going from a straight and level to a climb, and from a climb back to straight and level, and from a straight and level to a descent. Try to descend at different airspeeds. Try to climb maybe at different airspeeds. Just get used to setting your airspeed with your trim wheel. By the way, your trim, just if you don't remember from our the streams we did, maybe the first or second stream we did, when you're setting your trim, that is, let me just, hard to see, isn't it? That's this guy, this little piece right here on the elevator. Maybe if I get under it. And the way you could see it, it's on the right side. You can see there's that piece right here that goes up and down. And that is your trim tab. And so when I adjust, actually let me go ahead and adjust my trim. I'm just going to do it from the outside. So let's say I use nose up trim. See how the plane just jumped up because I'm using nose up. The trim tab will start to, this piece will start to adjust. Let me try to do it again. It's a little bit hard to see. Probably easier to see if I was landed. I did show this, I did demonstrate this on another stream, but we can try to go the other way with it. What happens is it's a little hard to see because now I'm having to adjust for the it's really hard to do. I probably should just be at the airport to demo it. So let me do that real quick because I can't control the camera angle. So what I'm going to do, just to show you that real quick, I'm going to load something where I am on the ground. Because that is very difficult to see, I know, and I apologize for that. Because trim is an important part. You don't want to grow muscles by having to push the yoke forward all the time or hold it back. That gets old, would tire your arms out. So this trim is very important. So hopefully this doesn't take too long to load. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, oh, here it is. It's up right here. That's perfect. See how it's pointing? See how it's pointing up? The trim tab. Right there. So again, so right now that's nose down trim because the wheel's all the way up. See the nose down? So if I spin it downward, you'll see, I don't know if you can see that. Let me zoom in. So this is takeoff position right here. So that means the trim tab is now, if I zoom in here and look, see how it's even now? Pretty much even, Steven, because that's takeoff. And then if I go to nose up trim, we're forced the plane to pitch up, the nose to pitch up. See how it's down now, like this. So, so I wanted to show that. Just a little hard to show that when you're flying around. So that's how the trim works, and you saw that in action today. So I apologize that ATIS is on, isn't it? But anyway, practice all that. Get that off. So practice all of that. Try that, and let me know how it goes for you. And you know, enjoy putting this into practice. And we will continue forward next week at the same time. So we will talk to you all then. Take care now.